Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here at the 2016 Federalist Society Conference for Intellectual Diversity in Academia. Thank you all for being here so early on this unfortunately rainy day. So we'd like to get things started with Dean Magill, who's here to give some opening remarks. So please help me in welcoming Dean Magill.
Well, thank you. Let me join the co-presidents and thank you all for being here, for taking the time to participate. I know many of you have come from far away, and some of you have come from Newcomb Building right across the way, and we appreciate all of you who've come from away to participate in this conference. I want to thank the Federalist Society student leaders. We have some of them here, but not everybody, I think, yet, for hosting the event, as well as many other events they host on our campus. They add enormously to the intellectual life of Stanford Law School by bringing in speakers and having debates and conversations that enrich the community intellectually in numerous ways. So we benefit greatly from the work that they do that helps the school. So it's no secret to anyone in this room that American law schools attract a majority of faculty and in some cases students from the left-hand side of the political spectrum. This trend is reflected in the profession at large. A recent study found that lawyers are more liberal than doctors, bankers, or accountants, though not quite as liberal as journalists or tech workers. But we all know that a classroom full of people who think the same is unenlightening, and it's actually boring. So a diversity of ideas and viewpoints is actually absolutely essential to the classroom, to students' learning, to the advancement of knowledge about law and legal reform, and to the dynamism of any intellectual community. Another reason this is an important conference to hold is central to our profession, the legal profession and law schools and the academic study of law, are the values of fair-mindedness, tolerance, and rigorous debate. The structure and confines of this debate have been very controversial and hotly contested on campuses in these last few years, and in a couple of weeks, the Conn Law Center is going to hold an interesting symposium on that question. Here at Stanford, I think we're far from perfect. I can unequivocally say that I think our community is deeply committed to free speech, to a diversity of ideas, and respectful debate. I have been lucky enough, both here at Stanford and at University of Virginia, where I both was a student and taught, to be challenged and engaged by people whose viewpoints pushed conventional academic wisdom, that advanced our knowledge about law, and selfishly made my life a lot more interesting than it would have been otherwise. I'm incredibly grateful to be at Stanford with two colleagues, Pam Carlin and Michael McConnell, for example, two of the sharpest and most divergent legal minds in academia today, as evidenced by the fact that both of them have been suggested as successors to Justice Scalia. I'm really sorry I'm going to miss Dean Kramer this afternoon, but his embrace and the standard he set for the embrace of lively engagement among faculty and students was really important to the conversations that continue at the law school today. I will be spending my time this afternoon recruiting admitted students, trying to convince them they should come here, which they should. So there's a lot to be said about the state of intellectual diversity on campuses, why it matters, whether it's expanded or contracted, how to foster it more vigorously, but I'm going to leave that to the group of impressive panelists you're going to hear from today. I think the fact of this conference being here at Stanford, also the fact that you've made time out of your schedule to come and commit to this ongoing conversation makes me hopeful about legal institutions and the profession. I'm going to welcome now Gene Meyer, who's going to say a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Dean Magill, and thanks to Stanford Law School, and thanks also to our chapter for hosting this. I'm going to be incredibly brief, but what I do want to say is this general discussion, general question of intellectual diversity is important for all the reasons Dean Magill said, and I'm even going to say one thing which might be slightly more debatable, which is when you look at a presidential campaign that we've had where 75 or 80% of the people in one party and 40 or 45% of the people in the other party are supporting candidates who are, quote, outsiders in some sense, and seem as though many of those voters feel as though their views are not being heard, not being listened to. And whatever you make of the candidates who are getting that support, I think that's a pretty strong statement and about what happens when views are not listened to. And I think one of the places where some of that can start and should start is in the academic world, where people should be listening to a wide variety of views, especially views they don't think they agree with. So I'm very pleased with this conference here, and I hope it can help encourage more attention to genuine intellectual diversity. So with that, thanks very much. Thanks for the work in doing this, and look forward to the conference.
Thanks very much to Dean Magill and President Gene Meyer. With that, let's start our first panel on recent research in intellectual diversity in academia. Please join me in welcoming Professors Cole, Phillips, Lindgren, and Shields.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to Stanford and to this Federalist Society conference on what I think is a really important topic. It's often said that a religious belief is one that persists despite the facts. And in this particular case, it's hard to determine whether or not the belief that there's balance and diversity in legal education or in higher education generally, unless we explore the facts. And that's what this panel is designed to do today. So we have three distinguished panelists to help us explore the facts surrounding intellectual diversity. The first is Jim Lindgren. James Lindgren is a professor of law at Northwestern. He holds a BA from Yale and a JD and a PhD in quantitative sociology from the University of Chicago. That's a fancy way of saying he's a statistician. He's the co-founder of the section on scholarship and Association of American Law Schools, and he's the former chair of its section on social science in the law. He is also famous for his work with respect to the exposure of Michael Balliol in Fall from Grace, Arming America, and the Balliol Scandal, which was published in the Yale Law Journal. We also have James C. Phillips. Oh, I should say one more thing about Jim Lindgren before I move on. Jim Lindgren is actually wanted in several Western states for being the person who taught me to play golf. James Phillips is a law clerk for the Honorable Thomas B. Griffith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He also recently clerked for the Honorable Thomas Lee of the Utah Supreme Court. He holds a JD and a PhD from UC Berkeley in jurisprudence and social policy, and he's written several articles on intellectual diversity in higher education. Jon Shields is an associate professor at Claremont McKenna. He holds a BA from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a PhD from the University of Virginia. He specializes in abortion law, American conservatism, American culture and politics, religion and politics, and he's the author of Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. Is that book? It's out now, okay, from Oxford University Press. Okay, so we'll start with Jim Lindgren.
Okay, so let's have some fun talking about numbers. I guess I'd like to start by saying that, consistent with what Dean Magill said, Stanford's statement on diversity seems to be geared to the graduate school. I couldn't find a more general one that wasn't for the graduate school, but it says a wide range of opinions, perspectives, and experiences is essential to educational excellence. A diverse community of scholars asks unexpected questions and contributes divergent insights, pushing the forefront of knowledge further and faster. That doesn't sound like most American universities that I know. And I guess academics are pretty slow to recognize that the typical groups that are being pushed for affirmative action and the typical groups that would actually add diversity of viewpoint based on life experiences or other views of the world are actually quite different. I favor both affirmative action and diversity hiring. I think they're both positives. But you'd think that, in many occupations they absolutely are consistent. But in academics, they're not consistent. They haven't been consistent for decades, and yet people are still acting as if they're really the same thing. The bulk of legal academics are white men and white women. Typical white men vote Republican. Typical white women vote Republican. Exit polls in the 2012 election showed that Romney beat Obama by 14% among white women. Not even close in an election that Obama won. In the 90s, when I first started working on this, white women tended to be Democrats. That's not true anymore. So now we have the great bulk of legal academics and academics more generally, in which we have very unrepresentative people supposedly bringing their life experiences based on their ethnicity and gender to bear, and yet that's not happening. Okay, now let's start with the slides. So this panel is supposed to be on existing work. In 93, 94, I surveyed faculty on the top 100 law faculties. I got 710 responses, which was a 66% response rate. I assure you, polling these days, national polls tend to get about 5 or 10%. The only people that still get up in that range is really the General Social Survey from Newark at Chicago. And then I found 13% were Republicans or leaned Republican, 80% were Democrats or leaning Democratic. Then in 2013, I took the data on race and gender and applied it to the ABA data on ethnicity. I took the political and religious data from the earlier survey and said, so if white females were just as democratic as they were in the mid-90s, what would be the makeup of faculties today? And if we do that, 11% were Republicans or leaning Republican, 82% Democrats or leaning Democratic. That's because we have more women and more minorities. Then McGinnis did a study of political donations at the top schools. 29% of law professors made donations, 15% exclusively or predominantly to Republicans, 81% to Democrats. Bonica has a study, actually a bunch of studies, but among them was one on campaign donations among lawyers, and found that the strongest predictor of liberal donations was being a law professor, stronger than gender or being a civil rights or environmental lawyer. So the idea that, well, they're just reflecting lawyers is not quite true. Lawyers are one of the more left-wing occupations, but nothing close to academics. Phillips has done content analysis scholarship, and he's also done entry-level stuff. Some people can't be assigned, so just looking at the people who can be assigned, a 14% leaning right, 86% leaning left. Then on entry levels, Deborah Jones Merritt did a 1998 survey of 6 years of new law hires. 10% identified as conservative, 75% liberal. Then Phillips has also looked at resumes and scholarship of new law professors, found 12.7% Republican conservative, but there were some that were unknown. The earlier study looking at in 1997, the 25 most underrepresented groups of law professors compared to the full-time working population, not highly educated or lawyers, ranked by percentage differences. Not one of them was an ethnic minority, and that was 1997. If you break down by ethnicity, gender, party, and religion, the largest subgroup in the U.S. population was white female Protestant Republicans. There were none in the sample of 710 law professors. Should have been about 90 representative. Now, I was taught how to do charts, and I really, really apologize for this. I hadn't realized how terrible this would show. So it's more for me to look at than for you, unfortunately. I really, really, really am embarrassed about it. But in any event, this is actually ABA data. So there's no surveys, nothing. All I've done is compare it to comparison populations. These are groups that are significant. Here's the law professors, so it's 30, and these are tenure track law professors, tenure track. 36% are female, 64% are male. The full-time working population that are English fluent, it's 54% male, 45% female. So you can see in this breakdown, females are underrepresented. Lawyers, 32% are female, so law professors are slightly overrepresented. Basically, if you look at these two comparison groups, the only group that's significantly overrepresented against both groups is Asian Pacific males, and even that is not a very large overrepresentation. If you look at the ones that are underrepresented, the only groups are this small group of two or more races, and that's mostly how the ABA counts. So they weren't even represented by a single person per faculty. So it's a very small. So basically what you have is that groups are either represented fully or underrepresented at so trivial a matter that it's not consistent. So there isn't a consistent underrepresentation or overrepresentation. We tend to think of underrepresented groups, but pretty much everybody is in at least one significant underrepresented group and one significant overrepresented group. It's interesting in the talk that you've been hearing really for quite a while, almost 15 or 20 years, intersectionality. If the intersectionality involves being a Democrat, then almost every group is going to be overrepresented who's Democratic, and if it involves Republican, on the intersectionality, almost every group is going to be underrepresented. This is the groups. This is ethnicity, party, and religion law professor with the 2013 estimates applied to the ABA data. And the most underrepresented group is white Christians, non-Latino white Christians. They're underrepresented about 25%. If you wanted to get up to parity on a typical law faculty of 40, I know Stanford's a bit bigger than that, and you didn't fire anybody, you'd have to fire 25 white Christians on every law faculty to get the numbers up to parity. If you just Christians overall, you'd have to hire 26. If you're trying to put it with the working population, you'd have to hire 56 Christians on every faculty of 40 to get up to parity. Now, perhaps one of the things is, so maybe the people, this analysis basically assumes that white females are just as Republican or Democratic as they used to be, white males are just as Republican and Democratic as they used to be, minorities are just as Republican. What if you up these things that the odds of being Republican were 50% higher now still you find that Republicans would still be ranked fifth among, even if the odds were 50% higher Republican, then there'd be 16%. And so these are the underrepresented groups. As you can see, there are very few that are minorities. There's only minority other religion, which is a tiny group, is underrepresented on this list, and minority Jewish. So a couple of fairly small groups. Then these are the overrepresented groups. So here in the overrepresented groups, you can see that there are groups that are overrepresented against both comparison populations. Minority atheists, and let's see, Democratic Jewish, no surprise there. White Jewish, no surprise there. I didn't want to have too many categories here, so these are only defined by one or two groups. So I didn't break it down to white female Democrat. There'd be white Democrat, female Democrat, so forth. And you see that the group that has the most is Democrats, not surprising. and then atheists second. And you can see that this first group up to here is all atheists or no, Democrats or atheists or overrepresented. Okay. Now, James Phillips is going to be talking mostly about the difference and why this could happen. And I just wanted to go into a little bit of it because there's these views in the press and in academics, that Republicans and conservatives are dumb, or they want to make money, or things like that. And Phillips' data is actually much more to the point than mine, but I just wanted to show. And actually, the fact that you don't know this already is a function of just how the effects of bias in the academy. There have been dozens of studies that have done dozens of surveys that have done general social surveys that have included verbal IQ tests on them. And for English speakers, it was drawn from an earlier version of an IQ test, and there are 10 questions. And if you look at the whole period in which they've asked, and I didn't update it with 2014 data yet, but 1978 to 2012, Republicans got 6.1 questions correct on the out of 10. Democrats 5.6, Independents 5.8. If you just look at the more recent data, you can see that Democrats have come up a little bit in that and almost caught Independents. Now, if you look at liberal conservative, there you find liberals are on top in that. But conservatives are in the middle, and moderates are at the bottom. So even on this, there's no reason to say conservatives are less bright than liberals. And then if you just look at liberal Democrat versus conservative Republicans, you find that conservative Republicans have a higher overall, and just 1/100th of a point, obviously not significant, even in recent years. Then, what kinds of things do you value in a job? There's great data on this. It's been asked of thousands of respondents over the years. And one of them is that they rate things that you might want in a job: high income, no danger of being fired, working hours are short, lots of free time, chances for advancement, and work important and gives a feeling of accomplishment. There's entire literature in social psychology that says that conservatives want safe jobs and high income, and they're less interested in this. Turns out the data is completely opposite of what people report. They generally use unrepresentative samples and weird measures of whether you're conservative or not. And so here we find that if you scored it a 1, the most important, it would be lower. So Democrats have a very slightly higher, more likely to pick valuing high income in the job. And then for conservatives and also for liberals. And if you limit it just to those with graduate professional degrees, then you find that, although it's not significantly, then you find Republicans are a little bit more likely to go for money. So there is something in the story that may suggest there's a bit of a contrary story possible. Even that overall Republicans don't value money more, maybe with high education, with graduate professional degrees, they might. Then there's also literature on altruism, and the GSS has an altruism scale with things like have you donated blood, returned money after getting too much change, given money to a charity, done volunteer work for a charity, and so forth. And on that scale, the Republicans score higher than Democrats, conservatives score higher than liberals, conservative Republicans higher than liberal Democrats. So my opinion here is that there is some discrimination on faculty hiring. I think that it's possible that culture plays a role, but the underrepresentation is so massive that I don't think that it could all be culture. I do think there's very little discrimination on tenure. Once you're in the institution, people who are lean conservative tend to do conventional work, use conventional techniques, and I don't think that they are, and once they find out that they're not monsters, people tend to treat them pretty fairly, I think, on tenure. I do think occasionally that people who don't deserve tenure should get tenure. Actually, I was at one of these conferences at another top law school. I don't want to name names, but the person up there was very decent to come on the panel and talk, and he said, at this law school, I just don't see that it has, that politics has any effect on hiring and retention. And I'm sitting next to Lee Otis, and I'm like hopping, saying, I once had to write a memo to get somebody tenure that I didn't want to tenure when I was associate dean, and I wrote about what the tenure standards were at the top schools. And he was the example that I used for you can get tenure at this great law school with 0 publications between the time you are appointed and the time you go for tenure. Now, he had a tenure paper that was published after that 0 publications in 6 or 7 years. And so, what I want to ask is, do you think for a minute that you would have been tenured had you been on the right? And I think that the answer, in his case at least, would no, as wonderful a person as he is, by all accounts. And I think we have to start recognizing that discriminated against groups historically are not necessarily the same as the underrepresented groups. We only have to look at Jews, for example, to realize that you could be both overrepresented and discriminated against, or Asians. And certainly at Stanford, where undergraduates, Asians are a huge proportion of the population, it doesn't mean you haven't been discriminated against just because you're, at some point, just because you're overrepresented. Just because you're discriminated does not lead to the fact that you might be underrepresented. And so that my thesis is basically diversity does not equal affirmative action, and as a profession, we're incredibly slow to reach this conclusion.
Thank you, Jim.
Oh, sorry.
So, from an empirical perspective, more interesting than that there are so few is why there are so few. And so to try to get some analytical leverage on this, I want to engage in an exercise of historical imagination. Let's assume that you've come to America in the early 1950s knowing nothing about this country, nothing about its past, nothing about its current condition. And you fall in love with baseball. And you go to game after game after game, and you quickly notice something. There are not very many African-American baseball players in the major leagues in the early 1950s. So you start to kind of wonder why. And their first thought is, well, maybe there aren't very many because they're just not that interested in baseball. There's just other things they'd rather do. And then you'd notice all of the African-American children playing baseball in the sandlots. And you'd see the all-black leagues. And you'd quickly realize it's probably not a lack of interest problem. So then maybe you'd theorize, well, maybe they can make more money elsewhere. It's an issue of economics. But you probably soon realize, as you looked around the country, that in the early 1950s, the economic opportunities for African Americans were rather poor, to put it a bit of an understatement, and that professional baseball players made a lot of money. So it's probably not a money issue. Then you might think, well, maybe they're just not as good as the white players. They just can't quite, in general, cut it, and so very few make it to the elite levels of the game. But then you notice that the very few African-American baseball players in the major leagues in the 1950s were really good. We're talking Ernie Banks, Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson. The proportion of Hall of Famers amongst African-American baseball players in the 1950s is so much higher than amongst the white players. And the average African-American was so much better than the average white player that you'd soon realize it probably wasn't a talent issue. And then you'd be left with maybe the only other explanation, some form of discrimination. And as far as baseball in the 1950s goes, you'd be correct. Now, without drawing any kind of moral equivalence between 1950s baseball and race and today, let's come to a different profession and a different era. I think that Daniel Gilbert at Harvard captured all of these hypotheses why there's so few conservatives and libertarians in academia in general and in legal academia when he said that liberals may be more interested in new ideas, more willing to work for peanuts, or just more intelligent. What I call the brain power, interest, and greed hypothesis. Brain power is that they just can't cut it intellectually. The interest hypothesis that the life of the mind or the ivory tower is just not what gets conservatives and libertarians' juices flowing. Or the greed hypothesis is they can make more money elsewhere. And the reality is a good lawyer in this country can make more than a law professor. Now, Harold Bloom has a reaction to that, or Paul Bloom, sorry. He says there's a lot of irony in this area. The same people who are exquisitely sensitive to discrimination in other areas are often violently antagonistic when it comes to political orientation, bringing up cliched arguments that they wouldn't accept in other domains. They aren't smart enough. They don't want to be in the field. And I kind of like this quote from Pascal Emmanuel Gobry where he says, I've had the following experience more than once. I am speaking with a professional academic who is a liberal. The subject of the underrepresentation of conservatives in academia comes up. My interlocutor admits that this is indeed a reality, but says the reason why conservatives and are underrepresented in academia is because they don't want to be there, or they're just not smart enough to cut it. I say that's interesting. For which other underrepresented groups do you think that's true? An uncomfortable silence follows. Now, it's not that the brain power, the greed, or the interest hypothesis could not be correct. That is an empirical question. And so what I'm trying to get at is see which of these four different potential hypotheses, bringing in a discrimination hypothesis, seems to be more supported by the data. So let me describe the data here. I'm looking at faculty, traditional tenure-track faculty, so I'm excluding clinical professors and legal research and writing professors. At the top 16 law schools, according to U.S. News, I took this data in the summer of 2011. And for the kind of outcome variable, I'm looking at publications per year and citations per year. Because the reality is, at least at elite law schools, scholarship is the name of the game. That's how you get positions, that's how you get tenure, except maybe in a few instances. That's how you get a reputation. And so we're looking at publication citations. I've also got demographic variables, traditional qualifications, some control variables, and then measuring political orientation. How was that measured? It was measured with looking at resumes. So are there organizational affiliations? Did they put FedSoc on their resume? Is there work experience? Did they do a summer at the NRA? And looking at campaign donations and voter registration records. A little bit at scholarship, but scholarship is kind of a fuzzy signal, and so unless it's a really clear signal, scholarship really didn't add much. But that's what goes into the political orientation variable. Okay, so what would the data have to look like to see whether one of these hypotheses is supported over another? So the brain power hypothesis. Intelligence or ability is almost always normally distributed. So let's say that we have a normal distribution of ability for non-conservative and libertarian law professors, with on the right being higher and the left being lower. What you see is conservatives and libertarians, if they are less able or less intelligent, their normal distribution would shift left. And then what you're going to have is you're going to have a cutoff point for making it into legal academia. You have to have a certain level of ability to be able to get in. And so only a very few of the conservatives and libertarians would make it in the door, and compared to the pool of law professors, they're going to be on the lower end. Okay? So that's what the data would look like if the brain power hypothesis is correct. If it's the greed hypothesis, it'll look similar, maybe not quite as strong. Basically what you're going to have is you're going to have conservatives and libertarians going to where they can make the most money, so the best are not coming to the academy. They're going to in-house counsel or big law firms or something like that. And so you've got the people who are coming to the academy are those who couldn't make more money elsewhere. So they're going to be a little bit lower on the ability pool. Then, if it's the interest hypothesis, if it has nothing to do with ability, You just have fewer that are interested, but otherwise they're going to look the same. So they're going to be randomly distributed amongst the professor pool as far as ability goes. So you shouldn't see any difference between conservatives and libertarians and those who are not as far as these outcome measures. And if it's the discrimination hypothesis, then your distributions of ability are going to pretty much essentially overlap. They're going to be identical. But what you're going to see is for the liberals, where I guess liberals and moderates are unknowns, all the non-conservatives and libertarians, you're going to have a cutoff here. But for the conservatives and libertarians, the cutoff is going to shift to the right. Okay? There's fewer that are going to be able to make it in. But those few that do come in are going to be those who do very well. Okay? So you're going to see that it's going to look like 1950s baseball. Okay, so that's what the data will look like if any of these hypotheses are correct. So let's first look at qualifications. Conservatives are much more likely than liberals, and the green is unknowns, of people that couldn't be coded, which was about 27%, couldn't put them into one camp. Much more likely to have a Supreme Court clerkship. Slightly more likely to be on law review compared to those who are coded as liberals, but moderately more likely than the unknowns. A little bit more likely than the unknowns on coming from a higher ranked institution for their JD, higher meaning more prestigious, and moderately more likely than the liberals, and moderately less likely than liberals to have a PhD, and somewhat significantly less likely than unknowns to have a PhD. So kind of a mixed bag on the qualifications. Kind of depends on where you want to put the weight. So maybe a little bit more qualified, but not the strongest evidence one way or the other. And now let's get into the publications per year and citations per year. And let me set this up. I know that most of us went to law school to avoid numbers, but I need to explain this. So in causal inference, the ideal world, which can never happen, is you have somebody do something, and then you reverse time and have them do the other thing, and then you see the difference, right? But because we can't do that, we run experiments, but so often some of the most important things you can't run experiments on, which includes this. It'd be a fascinating experiment. And so you're stuck with trying to use fancy statistics to try to compensate. Basically what you want to have apples compared to apples. It's hard to say that somebody who graduated from Yale and somebody who graduated from, I'm not going to name any other school, but Podunk University Law School are quite the same, right? It's hard to say that somebody who has a U.S. Supreme Court clerkship and somebody who had a state trial clerkship are quite the same. So really you want to compare apples to apples. And in order to do that, there are various techniques. There's matching techniques, there's weighting techniques, there's propensity scores. And those things at the end of the day are trying to get you looking at apples to apples. And the only thing that differs is the one thing of interest, right here, which is political orientation. When you do that, you lose data, right? So you see over here in Model 1, this is regression. This is often what people will do. And regression doesn't get rid of anything. So it ends up comparing apples to oranges and trying to make it work. And you can see that those lines there, the 0.25 above and below, you don't want to have variables above that, outside of those lines, because then you aren't really comparing apples to apples. You're getting apples to oranges. So some of these other techniques, the nearest neighbors matching, the Corson exact matching, propensity score weighting, are getting rid of data that doesn't match very well until you'll see model 7 and 8 there. There we're really comparing apples to apples. So as far as the outcome variables are going to be concerned, those are the ones that are going to be the most accurate. The danger is when you trim data, your standard errors blow up and you may not get statistical significance. So it's a trade-off. Statistical significance versus accuracy in the variable. Fortunately, here, all of the models were statistically significant, so we didn't have that problem. So let's look at additional publications per year for conservatives and libertarians. It ranges anywhere from about 0.4 to a little over 0.8. Again, the models on the far right are the ones that we think are more accurate, more apples to apples, but you could look at any of the models if you'd like. And what does this mean? This means over a 5 or 6 year, 10-year period, conservatives and libertarians at these institutions are publishing anywhere from 4 to 5 more publications over that period. That's a lot. That's a lot, especially if you think of maybe having a one publication per year requirement to get tenure, which apparently in some places is not the case, but if that's, that's a lot more over a pre-tenure period, or any tenure period, really, any period. So, but it's publications. There's 1,000 law journals in this country. You can get almost anything published, right? So maybe conservatives and libertarians are just publishing garbage. So if they are, maybe they're not getting cited so much, but that's not the case. Conservatives and libertarians are getting cited, depending on which model you prefer, anywhere from 13 to 37 more times per year. And to put that in perspective, of the professors, the little over 1,000 professors in this data set, they were averaging being cited about 41 times a year. So again, a substantial increase here. Now again, you can think of reasons why conservatives and libertarians are being cited more. Maybe they're a smaller network and they're just citing each other to drive citations up. Or maybe they're the contrarian voice, and so you cite to the opponent before you try to destroy them. But the reality is there's one explanation that explains this outcome and the publication's outcome and the qualifications outcome. All right, so what? I think there's three problems, and I think another panel is going to get into this, but who cares? So what that there's so few, and maybe the data is consistent with discrimination. Well, I think there's harm to liberal law students. I think there is potential harm to conservative and libertarian law students and some of their mentoring and clinical opportunities, and I think there's potential for an echo chamber in legal scholarship. I just want to hit on the first point with this quote from a former American Constitution Society chapter president at Berkeley. If any of you don't know, the ACS is like the counter to FedSoc, right? It's the liberal equivalent. He said, attending a law school that is not ideologically diverse substantially undermines the value of the education. There are myriad divides in the law over very important issues that we as lawyers will face when we enter the legal field as professionals. When we only bring up one side to caricature and deride it, a few things happen. First, the very few students who are ideologically predisposed to those sides feel marginalized, thereby undermining their education. More importantly, by treating those opinions as such, we are not seriously evaluating them and will be extremely ill-equipped to grapple with them in the real world. I am a liberal, but hope to be able to engage with conservative ideas in law school and have been deeply disappointed with the perfunctory and cavalier attitude with which we assess conservative ideas at my law school. I think we'll be much worse as practitioners, and ironically, we'll be much less capable of advocating for liberal ideas because of our failure to seriously grapple with conservatism in our law school climate. So, findings, conservatives and libertarians are a small minority. In my sample, it was 10%. They are somewhat more qualified than their peers based on traditional qualifications, depending on how you weight that. They do publish more than their peers at substantial and statistically significant levels. They are cited more than their peers at substantial and statistically significant levels. So the conclusion? The data is inconsistent with a brain power, greed, or interest hypothesis, particularly a brain power hypothesis. The data are consistent with a discrimination hypothesis, and when I say discrimination, we often think of invidious discrimination. The data does not have anything to say about that. There are different ways that discrimination occurs, and I don't know why it's happening here based on this data, but it is consistent with discrimination. But it's one study. Social sciences, not the natural sciences, not law of gravity here. It's hard to say you've proven something. You can say that something is more consistent or less consistent. More studies are needed to see if that data is also consistent with this or if it points us in a different direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Jon Shields.
Thank you. No, I don't need this stuff. Well, I'm going to talk about bias in the social sciences. Conservatives are quite scarce in the social sciences. There's about 5% of social scientists are conservatives, and most of them are concentrated in economics, where they seem to gather and cluster. Conservatives are so rare in the social sciences that they're outnumbered by Marxists. Indeed, they're badly outnumbered by Marxists. About 18% of social scientists self-identify as Marxist, compared to fewer than 5% of social scientists. Given these numbers, you might not be surprised to discover that conservatives are less well represented in the social sciences than all current targets of affirmative action. Why are they so scarce? Partly because conservative students steer clear of the social sciences as undergraduates before they even begin to think about graduate school. One study found that undergrads' politics is the best predictor of their undergraduate major choice, with conservatives tending to gravitate into the natural sciences. It's possible, of course, that there's just some reason why these conservatives prefer the natural sciences. Perhaps there's something about their cast of mind that pulls them toward engineering and not sociology or history. But it's also the case that we know that conservatives tend to feel quite uncomfortable in fields that touch on politics. So, for example, there was a climate survey done at the University of Colorado which found that Republicans were more than 3 times as likely as their Democratic peers to feel intimidated when they shared ideas in their social science courses. Another study, this was an ethnography of conservatives, activists on college campuses, it found that even they tended to avoid coursework in the social sciences. And I think that's especially striking because these are students who are self-evidently interested in politics, right? They're very active in conservative politics. I think conservatives' discomfort with the liberalism of the social sciences is also evident in their gravitation toward PhD programs in economics. Economics is the one social science that's really quite open to conservatives. It's the one social science. It's the one social science that really looks like America, with roughly an equal proportion of Republicans and independents and Democrats. And then when conservatives do enter fields like history or political science, they tend to gravitate towards subfields that are the least politicized, right? So in history, they're much more inclined to enter subfields like ancient history or military history, and avoid areas like 20th century history. Okay. Now, perhaps these conservatives are just being sensible, right? After all, conservatives do face some bias in higher education, and it's not the implicit, subconscious variety many fear is an obstacle to women and minorities in higher education. Research shows that a surprising number of liberal professors will say, yes, we prefer to hire Democrats over Republicans. In one study, George Yancey found that some 30% of sociologists acknowledged that they would be less likely to hire a job applicant if they discovered that she was a Republican. Indeed, they've said that they prefer to hire communists over Republicans. But that's just far left sociology, right? The other fields aren't that way. No, that's not the case. Yancey found that 15% of political scientists and 24% of philosophers said that they would discriminate against a Republican job applicant. At least 30% of professors in all the fields Yancey studied said that they would discriminate against members of the NRA. And he found that these professors were less tolerant of evangelicals, partly, I think, because evangelicalism is a proxy for the cultural conservatism that is particularly disliked in academia. So nearly 60% of anthropologists, 50% of lit professors, 40% of political scientists and sociologists say they would be less inclined to hire a job applicant if they discovered she was an evangelical. That political bias was so easy to detect surprised some social scientists. When Joel Imbar corroborated Yancey's work by finding comparable levels of bias among social psychologists, he expressed surprise. He said, quote, "Usually you have to be pretty tricky to get people to say they discriminate against minorities. Other research suggests that liberal professors sometimes act on these conscious biases. So Stanley Rothman and Robert Lichter found that socially conservative professors tend to work at lower-ranked institutions than their publication record would predict. Phillips here found that libertarian and conservative professors tend to publish more than their peers. I think this finding is especially striking given that other work suggest that it's more difficult for scholars to publish work that reflects conservative interest and perspectives. Now, some of this bias, I think, is driven by misinformed prejudices, right? Neil Gross has shown that a surprising number of professors will say, yeah, you know, we think that conservatives tend to be close-minded, and that's why there's so few of them about. To correct such biases is a worthwhile goal. But even if they disappeared, even if every last professor in the country, right, stopped believing or didn't believe that conservatives were somehow close-minded, I think there'd still be political bias in academia. I think it would still exist because it also expresses an intellectual orientation, one that inescapably, I think, shapes the way we assess scholarship. Our politics, after all, inclines us to find some questions more interesting than others. It inclines us to find some explanations for social and political phenomena more compelling than others. I think because conservatives have too often likened bias in academia to more irrational kinds of prejudices, right, like gender or racial prejudices, they've been too slow, I think, to appreciate the durability of these biases and too impatient with their persistence. If we tell conservatives to pass on careers in academia until it's bias-free, we'll be waiting until kingdom come. I think reducing political bias to racial bias or gender bias also prevents us from thinking about the vital function that political biases serve in higher education, right? So while a community of narrow-minded bigots is rarely edifying, an academic community of professors with varied biases, I think, is essential to the very health of our social sciences. This is because none of us can rely on our fellow partisans to identify flaws in our own thinking. As the NYU psychologist Jonathan Haidt explained, quote, smart people make really good lawyers, but they are no better than others at finding reasons on the other side. The biggest problem then with academia, I think, is not really political bias. The problem is that there's not more of them, right? Academia's biases are just too one-sided. Okay? And political sameness, I think, in lots of disciplines undermines knowledge-seeking itself because it makes it hard for those communities to converge on the best approximation of the truth. Some may say, well, yes, but the social sciences are self-correcting over time. That may be true in some happy cases, but those corrections can take a very long time. I'll give you one quick example. Sociology spent decades downplaying the importance of two-parent households before finally admitting that family structure kind of matters. It kind of matters if there's not dads around in households. Right? As one conservative sociologist we interviewed told us, he said, quote, basically, sociology had to be dragged kicking and screaming until it recognized that broken families aren't a good thing. It's like if you had to spend decades and millions of dollars in NSF grants to convince astronomers that the sun rises in the east. Many more of these examples are now being assembled by a group of social scientists who are collaborating in a new project called Heterodox Academy, which is really the first large-scale effort to think about the ways that political sameness undermines knowledge-seeking in the social sciences. Perhaps this effort in time will convince more academics of the importance of having more conservative thinkers about in academia. I'll close briefly by just thinking about what kinds of things can be done in the short term. If this situation is going to improve, it's going to be liberals who are going to have to do something about it because they rule academia. And I think that they can do a few things to help make higher education, make the social sciences a somewhat more inclusive place. In hiring committees, liberal faculty might question their natural preference for like-minded colleagues. Right? As I suggested earlier, lots of progressives currently say they prefer to hire liberals, right, like-minded people. Before they start sorting through resumes, departments might consider advertising in fields that are more popular among conservatives, like military history, political history, the American founding, the sociology of religion, natural law and history. More hires in these areas would also bring balance to a university curriculum so dominated by race and gender. Universities might also experiment with having visiting professors of conservative thought, as the University of Colorado is currently doing. Even these modest reforms should help conservatives feel more welcome in academia and not just in some of its quarters. When that happens, I think the university will also deepen its public legitimacy and increasingly rare and fragile good in our polarized age. Thank you.
So I want to give an opportunity for each of you to comment, but I also have questions for each of you. I want to hopefully that you can address in your comments. So I'll just throw them out to you in seriatim. So for Jim Lindgren, you use interchangeably Democrat and Republican and liberal and conservative to make some of these points. Years ago, I remember you had done some work demonstrating that those concepts don't really map onto each other. So, for example, you demonstrated, I think, at one point that some of the most racist views held in society are held by conservative Democrats, and some more liberal views were held by Republicans. So I'd like for you to address that in your comments. James Phillips, I want to ask whether there might not be some type of selection bias involved in the qualifications measurement. So you hear these arguments that you can't really rely on clerkship or clerkship quality when considering candidates because Republicans have controlled the White House for so long that you have more Republican or conservative judges, and when that's the case, you wind. And you also hear this with respect to the honors program at the Justice Department. That because Republicans have had such a stranglehold on the White House that they've basically rigged the game so that now you'll have more conservative law clerks coming out of law school. And for Jon Shields, are you suggesting that we've reached a tipping point? And can we ever get balance if what you say is true about, particularly about the social sciences, but also I would suggest in law schools. So why don't we start with you, Jim? Okay, so
if you interpreted me as equating the two, because I didn't make any distinctions between them, what you described is absolutely a huge part of what I've been working on. But to make my case, I didn't need to mention liberal conservative at all. And I thought, to be fair, I should show the areas where liberals did well and not just pretend that there's nothing to this overall thing. So that was only for purposes of balance that was in. I was not equating. So that even if you pick the way of measuring that's least congenial to the point I was making, you still don't have conservatives at the bottom. Now, a bunch of things really clicked for me. One was James Phillips left out the neatest table in his paper, in which he shows that while in early years people who lean right are somewhat more productive and more cited, as time goes on, liberal productivity falls in half and Republican productivity stays the same for 30 years. So 3 decades into your career, Republicans are publishing at the same level they did when they were young, while Democrats have fallen roughly in half. And that's the neatest chart in the whole thing, and it really suggests also the point you're making about commitment to the ideas. And I'll come back to you in a second, but then for Shields, one of the things that you implied, and it's definitely true, it's worse in other areas than in law. Law, with its devil's advocate kind of habit and style of teaching, is actually better than a lot of these other fields. So I don't think we should lose sight that things could be worse. Now, as far as the cluster in economics, I thought that the data, and I was just looking online and donation data, that economists were 75% Democratic. And so even though they are much more diverse than other fields, they still lean Democratic. The other thing is that you look at Stanford. Now, Stanford, this is just from talking to faculty members. I don't have I don't have any way of actually knowing what the political views are of the people there. But the impression I get is you got 5, 6, 7 people who lean right. But pretty much all but 1 or 2 are in economics. So it's definitely a ghetto in a sense, and it really on this faculty needs to be broadened into other fields besides Michael McConnell. One of the, sometimes people have admitted, I've had people actually, one very prominent libertarian was blocked after we got unanimous vote of the faculty because a senior member of our faculty lobbied the dean and said, don't make the offer. We can't have so many of our people at Northwestern are conservative, partly because other people pass on them. Of our top 10 most cited people, 6 are conservative, and we're probably 25% leaning to the right on the tenure track. That they blocked. When I was at Chicago Kent, we had people, when I found out people had voted solely because a woman who actually turned out to be a Democrat was unwilling to talk about politics, they thought she was a conservative Republican. So they voted against her. I was able to undo that one. And then, of course, the first thing she does is go work for the Clinton transition team, which she did 2 months into her to do it. And even this year on hiring, there are 2 people we hired that I think we had got because one of our committee said, oh, he'll go too high. And I said, well, I don't know how conservative is he. I don't think he's very conservative, but he is a Posner clerk. Unless you're an obvious liberal Posner clerk, which there are many, he's probably not going to go as high as people think. And we had another person, the home school, said, don't bother, we're going to hire this person. Well, the person who I think is a liberal had done a study, and they were trying to find the police were discriminating. And, they sort of were able to find this little area, but basically they didn't. And so at this very liberal faculty, that was it. Didn't matter how good the training was. Didn't matter that he mostly wrote about other stuff. Or take Tom Miles. Tom Miles at Columbia, who's now dean at Chicago. When he came up at Columbia, he presented a piece on why felon voting didn't matter. And as the appointments chair said to me, we've got an entire institute whose main project is to do felon voting. They might be interested in whether it's worth doing, but they're not. So he went, no problem for him. He went to Chicago. And James Phillips, the piece that he did, I think, is the best work in the field. He'll be on the market in a couple years. I've been saying write something that doesn't have a political valence. How many people in the entry level have written the best paper in their field before they join academics? We'll have a little experiment and see where James goes. But the schools that will look at him, UVA, Northwestern, maybe Chicago, Notre Dame, George Mason, Pepperdine, and then a few schools that aren't conservative but are particularly open-minded. BU, Alabama, Florida State, places like that. It's a really tough market for someone who comes off as doing work that's important and actually has a political valence.
James Phillips?
So I guess you can do an experiment in this field. I will be in a living experiment. So first, just real quickly, I wanted to respond to Professor Klo's question to Professor Lindgren, because I think it also implicates my piece and my coding. I think that actually political scientists have found that the parties have separated largely. It used to be that, you had liberal Republicans, you had conservative Democrats, and it's not that you still don't, but that the liberal conservative labels match up more than they used to with the parties. So again, they're not perfect proxies for each other, but they're better than they used to be. On the clerks, so two thoughts on that. First off, let's assume that it's easier for a conservative to get a clerkship than a liberal because there's more conservative or Republican-appointed judges than liberal-appointed judges. I'm not sure that's still the case now, but probably that was for long enough for this pool of professors that you could make that assumption. Well, we're talking about different pools here. We're not talking about who got a clerkship. We're talking about people who got hired to teach at top 16 law schools who have clerkships. And I have a hard time seeing that there's going to be much difference there. But you can actually empirically look at this, because if conservatives are getting some kind of equivalent affirmative action bump when it comes to getting hired as a clerk, such that they are less qualified and less able, but judges want ideologically compatible clerks, and so they're going to hire a less capable, less able conservative to clerk for them. When you do the matching analysis in the statistics, that would show up, right? When you're matching on clerkships, when you match two people who have the same clerkship, the conservative should actually perform less than the liberal because they got this kind of bump and they're not actually at the same level, but you actually see the reverse. So I actually don't think that there's a problem, A, because we're looking at a very elite pool, people who would have gotten clerkships regardless, and B, the matching actually corrects for that. And then finally, I just wanted to say that kind of in response to maybe how this can be corrected, and this actually isn't the most positive thing, but in baseball, the market was able to correct, because once the dam broke, there's a very simple measure of success. It's called winning. And winning brings fans and it brings money. And so once somebody else has a Willie Mays, you want a Willie Mays and you don't care. We don't have that in academia and in law school academia. What drives it is, there's a lot of things driving it, but U.S. News ranking drives a lot, and U.S. News doesn't take this into account. If it did, if intellectual diversity was built into the U.S. News rankings, then the market might be able to correct. Then you could have Moneyball, right? But because we don't have that, the market itself isn't going to be sufficient to correct this.
So, Jon Shields, can you depress us further and tell us that we've reached a tipping point and there's a point of no return?
Well, I'll say something optimistic, which is I think there's a long history of out-groups becoming in-groups in academia. And actually, economics is a nice example because, in the post-war period, economics was really dominated by Keynesians, and then by the 1970s, you have people like Hayek and Milton Friedman winning the Nobel Prize. And so it's we interviewed lots of libertarian economists, and they all said things like, gee, this is a much more friendly field than it would have been some decades ago. And so even as the other social sciences were drifting left and becoming less friendly to conservative thinkers, economics was drifting right. And so I think it speaks at least to the ability of higher education to change and become more pluralistic over time. Can that happen in sociology and history and these sorts of fields? I think so, but it's going to take some brave conservatives to sort of take the plunge, right? I don't see it getting better until that happens, right? And I think the encouraging thing is that they can succeed, right? There are challenges in the social sciences. There's obstacles. There's to being a conservative social scientist. But there's lots of thriving, successful conservative professors, even in fields like sociology. So I think it can be done, right? And I guess I am a little concerned about sort of the rhetoric too that's come out of the right. I think there's been a long history of movement conservatives pillaring the university. I understand why they do it, but I think the concern is that it might inadvertently push young conservatives away from academia, and therefore help cement progressives' very troubled rule over higher education. And so one of the things we hope to do in this book actually is just to provide a more clear-eyed view of this institution to young conservatives, because I do think it's an institution that they can succeed in.
So before we start taking questions from the audience, Jim Lindgren, you wanted to respond to...
Yeah, I wanted to respond to a couple of... one point, responding to the point that both of you made. This is the no-pressure point. We're so isolated and so stubborn as a field that we're willing to resist even our self-interest. It's a little like Hollywood making political movies that nobody wants to see. You'd think that the market would discipline them, but they don't seem to be getting the message. Think of Elena Kagan. She comes in at Harvard, and students say, we need to hire more people on the left. And she says flat out to them, no, actually, we need to hire more people on the right. And she does it. She shakes up legal education. Other schools start hiring people on the right for a while. And you know what? When there was a job she really wanted, guess what? They couldn't even find people to testify against her. I mean, I had one friend who went up and testified to explain her views but wouldn't oppose her. They couldn't find enough reputable law professors who would oppose her because everyone knew that she had been incredibly decent and open-minded. And it just shocks me that other deans don't get it. They don't realize that it's actually in their self-interest to be decent and fair in the hiring process. And even if they need to push their faculties a little bit, it makes some sense. And I'll end with one about economics. So think about Virginia. Virginia in the 1960s decided they wanted to get rid of Buchanan and Coase. Now, it's not like they didn't predict they could do good work. They had already done their Nobel Prize-winning work. And they found a memo later that explained the strategy. They decided to drive them out. And so they successfully did that. Coase said, we'll stay, just match Chicago's offer. They said no. And I have that. Coase told me that. I mean, so they had it on good authority. So then Virginia succeeds in doing this. They've never been one of the world's top economics departments since. Once they succeeded in their strategy, they have been a backwater. Do they feel the pressure? Certainly to an outsider, I don't see any pressure on the economics department at Virginia.
If you'd like to ask a question of the panel, we'd ask that you step up to the microphones. Doug Malaman?
First of all, on Elena Kagan, I think she had a unique advantage because of institutional problems at Harvard. She had the president giving her power that normal deans don't have. But anyway, I have a question that maybe reflects my information having arrived here a little bit late. But I heard a lot of the data about the discrimination and the impact that it has had for
Don't hear it.
Okay. The impact that has on scholarship. The implication being, of course, that conservative voices in the academy have been to some extent marginalized or silenced, and it's pretty compelling stuff. And I recognize that the question of diversity in the academy has important normative implications beyond what I'm about to ask. But a two-part question. If you included in the universe, in the denominator of the data, the scholarship and research that is being done by at non-teaching institutions, whether they're the Manhattan Institute or the Hudson Institute or Hoover or whatever, does the bias look so great? Because I can tell you, as a newspaper reader, it appears to me that the bulk of the voice from the non-academic think tanks is on the right. And second, if I'm right about that latter point, does the funding in those organizations have the perverse effect, perhaps, of diminishing the enthusiasm of conservative scholars for the academy and having them divert to non-teaching institutions like that?
Yeah, it's interesting questions. I don't know of any hard data that speaks to either question, actually. So what I would say would be simply speculative. I mean, I think that the think tanks are important. I think they do help broaden the conversation. But they also may have the disadvantage of being somewhat ghettoized too to those conversations, right? So I think it's very important, for example, to take the example of sociology, to have somebody like Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, right, to be a professor there, because I think he has more influence on sort of more mainstream academic conversations than somebody like Charles Murray would have, even though they both would have broadly similar, takes on culture and lots of social questions. Brad's publishing in sociology journals and engaging those, his fellow colleagues. He's part of the Guild, and so I think that that's important, right? And that matters. And so there's limits to, I think, how influential think tank types can be. Whether or not those, the fact that there's AEI or Heritage has sort of siphoned lots of conservatives out of academia, I don't know. Maybe some, but I don't know of any data that speaks to that question. It's an interesting hypothesis in question.
Professor Rick Sander.
Hi. So I've got a short question and a longer question for Professor Phillips. The short question is, what's the overall mean number of publications per year in your study? Because you said the conservatives are about an extra 1/2. I'm just curious what the base is.
I'm trying to remember.
You think it's under 1 or over 1?
I think it's around 1.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the longer question is, I think, I really like your findings, and it seems intuitively logical, and I like the analogy to baseball, but I want to push back a little bit on the discrimination. When you talk about discrimination, I take it the idea is sort of entry-level discrimination, how people come to be on the faculty, as opposed to sort of the broader hostile environment in which academics operate. So let's assume that for a moment. And let's assume that hiring is actually fair, but there is, in fact, a lot of, sort of the obvious level of unfriendliness to conservatives in academia, and maybe greater difficulty getting things published, and so on and so forth. Then it might be that the interest hypothesis, or even the greed hypothesis, could be consistent with the sort of skewing that you're seeing, because you'd have a self-selection of people who are, equally talented, but they are, and they're interested in academia, but they don't want to do it given the hurdles they see, unless they're confident that they can sort of beat the liberals at their own game. They have to have unusual level of self-confidence and sort of really be convinced that they can succeed in an environment that's often going to be hostile. Wouldn't that produce the same kind of self-selection and skewing that would be consistent with your results?
So 2 thoughts on that. One is you're telling a story, a self-selection story, that is not independent of discrimination. It's driven by discrimination, right? It's even if let's say it's a false perception amongst conservatives and libertarians that the academy is hostile, or that they have to overperform, they have to credential up, and it's not worth it. It's still that's being caused by either perception of or the reality of discrimination. But would the data look the same? I guess if conservatives said, look, I recognize there's a higher bar, and only those who are really motivated are willing to do that, then it might look similar, but there's still a discrimination story there. It's a discrimination story that's driving a self-selection effect. So I think if it's pure self-selection, pure interest, or pure money that's separate from discrimination, then the data wouldn't look like this. It only looks like this if discrimination is playing a role, whether it's the sole role or it's an intermediate factor driving the self-selection. Then I think that's so. Yes, that's true. That maybe self-selection, if it's self-selection of those who are more lower on the ability scale, are saying, yeah, I'm not going to be able to make it. I have to be I have to be Willie Mays, and I'm not Willie Mays. I can play with these players, but I'm not Willie Mays. I'm not going to try. I'll just stay where I'm at. But that's still there's still discrimination in that story.
So if I could just ask a follow-up, a more sort of the broader discrimination story as opposed to a higher discrimination story, but also might be consistent with what Jim pointed out, which is this curve in productivity, where folks who are really sort of have ambition and have all this dedication and rising productivity as they kind of figure out the terrain, figure out how they can flourish in that terrain. How large disparity do you see in productivity in the first 5 years?
Here's your chart if you want to read it.
Okay. Oh, so my publication rates were higher.
Yeah, they're about 1.3, 1.4 on average.
So in the first 5 years, there's a modest, conservatives and libertarians are a little bit higher, and then they pretty much stay straight for 30 years, maybe slightly going up, and everybody else, both liberals and unknowns, are just, by the time you get to 30 years, they're doing about twice as much per year. So it's a steady, it's the tenure effect, right? We see that, where after you get tenure, productivity tends to drop off, but not amongst conservatives and libertarians. Is that because only the best are getting in? Is that because those who are getting in are much more motivated and also are also the best, in a sense? It could be an interaction. It could be two things driving it, but I still don't think you can tell this story with this data that's completely divorced from any kind of discriminatory influence.
Professor Michael McConnell.
I had two just numbers questions. First is this changing over time, say over the last 20 years, getting better, getting worse, staying the same? And my second question is whether any of the data attempt to separate out public law from other areas of law, because my sense is that public law is way more skewed than the rest, and I would also say, as an opinion, public law is where diversity of views matters the most and where it exists the least.
So I can kind of answer that. The first one is I don't have data over time, but my cross-sectional data from 2011 you can break people out by cohorts. If we assume that conservatives and libertarians and everybody else retire or leave the academy at similar rates, now it's an assumption, but if we assume that, then a cohort of, say, from 30 who were hired 31 to 35 years ago would be a relative snapshot of what the academy was, at least the hiring was like at that time. And with that assumption, it's a relatively flat over time. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but and maybe there's a slight uptick, when you're getting the 30, 40 years ago as far as a few more conservatives, libertarians, but the pattern is pretty consistent over time. As far as public law versus non-public law, I have an earlier piece that has a very small sample. I think I had about 300 entry-level hires from 2005 to 2009 that I'm now expanding to all entry-level hires from 2001 to 2010, but I don't have that data yet. So on the earlier data, the ratio of non-public law of liberals to conservative libertarians was something like 4.6 to 1, and when you got into public law, it was something like 9 to 1. So roughly double the ratio of liberals to conservatives and libertarians when you get into public law than not. So, with the argument that that's an area where you need even more viewpoint diversity, you have actually even less.
But doesn't that support your? I'm sorry. Doesn't that defy your conclusions with respect to the interest hypothesis? Right? Wouldn't that suggest that corporate and business law types are self-selecting?
So the problem with that data point is you can tell two stories from it. You could tell that people are like economics, business, that's where I'm going to go because that's what I'm interested in. You could also tell a story that that's where I'm going to go because that's where I'm going to get a job because they won't hire me. They're not going to hire a conservative to come teach con law. I'm not saying that conservatives don't get hired to teach con law, but so you can tell either story, right? Yeah. And then the question is, with all the other data points, is there a story that connects all of them, or
some data suggests that there's fewer conservatives now in the social sciences, and that those numbers have been going down since the 90s as the World War II generation retired, because that was a generational cohort that had more conservatives. And so it's getting a little worse, I think.
Professor Dan Lowenstein.
Thank you. I think by prescription, perhaps this is going to be the UCLA microphone. The panel emphasized almost exclusively two major parts of the university, the social sciences and the professional schools. Two other major areas, the natural sciences, including medical schools, and the humanities. I know least about the first of those. I'm inclined to think probably that the problems you're discussing are there, but perhaps less in degree and also perhaps less in their deleterious consequences. The humanities, though, it seems to me that if you had given figures, they'd probably be at least as stark as the ones that Jon Shields gave. And it seems to me that in the consequences, they're somewhat different, because in the law schools and in the social sciences, for the most part, I mean, this is not entirely true, but for the most part, they're still studying the things that they used to study and that they probably should study. In the humanities, there's a whole changing of the subject, so that, for example, in the UCLA English department, which had a lag, and I think for some time, and there's still some remnants of this, had more people doing sort of traditional study of literary works. The hires in the last decade or two, as I understand it, they've been overwhelmingly queer studies, cultural studies, and whatever one may think of those as disciplines, there is a displacing of reading great writers, not as some sort of anthropological or other social scientific subjects, but rather as sources of truth, goodness, and beauty. Those things just get displaced. So those are a couple of I realize that the work that you folks have done has been in the areas that it's been, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on these other major parts of the university.
I'll say something quickly about the natural sciences, actually. So there's in a lot of the natural sciences, there's lots of ideological balance in faculties. The problem is it just doesn't matter very much there, right? Because in the social sciences or the humanities, politics falls so close to the subject of inquiry that politics is a permanent problem in those areas. In the natural science, it does on occasion, right? One can think of climatology or something like this. But often politics doesn't matter very much, right? So in fact, if the physicists were dominated by Marxists, right, and sociology was balanced or something, nobody would care really. I mean, that would be it'd be sort of an interesting or odd fact about physics, right? That was true, and I guess there'd be some, social scientist who would be interested in making sense of that puzzle. But there'd be no David Horowitz barnstorming the country, right?
Environmental studies.
Yeah.
Public health.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, I haven't given enough thought to what are the quarters of the natural sciences where it matters. And I think it's something that I've been remiss about having given enough thought to, and I think that's true. It's actually interesting, right? It's also quite different from, if you think about the call for diversity, gender diversity in higher education, right? It matters to feminists that there aren't more women in physics and STEM fields. The call for the conservatives don't really seem to care that much, right? If there's balance in those areas, right? They're really concerned about a more narrow slice of the higher education. because they're not worried about, engineering being taught from a liberal point of view, right? And so they're more concerned just about these more what Marty Lipset called the political sciences when he wrote his classic on higher education.
I just want to address, I haven't looked at the data in a while, but there have been large-scale surveys that are done by universities that include faculty. And unfortunately, they don't ask Republican, Democrat, but they do ask liberal, conservative. And the humanities are like the most extreme social sciences. And so they're at least, if not slightly more, skewed. And then within the sciences, there's still majority for most of the sciences Democratic. There's some subfields that have always had more gender diversity. My wife's a geneticist, and she mostly trained with very prominent women geneticists. There's always been within biology, genetics has always been a field that women have been important for half a century.
Yeah, I was wanting to ask what role you think institutional diversity could play in the intellectual diversity within schools. So in the example of economics, I think much of what pulled economics, right words you might say, was the University of Chicago and the very unique School of Economic Thought that was pursued there, which resulted in dozens of Nobel Prizes and that kind of thing. And now folks who got their PhDs at Chicago are now throughout the field and are influencing economic thought to this day. And so I was wondering to what extent could something like that, George Mason is probably the closest sort of example of something that's kind of pursuing its own little brand and is doing well as a result of it, but it's not quite the same as Chicago economics. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, Chicago, which had been extraordinarily special in economics, actually a couple of deans embarked on a strategy of trying to reduce the identification of Chicago as a right-wing institution. So they actually have been working very hard to change their image and by reducing their hiring on the right. So even the enclaves where there have been a lot, there's often pushback against staying that way.
I think institutional diversity could help in as far as trying to have greater diversity in conversations and scholarship. If that means more of a viewpoint minority group could be hired and enter into that field. I don't think it helps with the classroom. I don't think it helps with the educational experience of students but it could help in some ways.
Lee Lieberman and Otis.
Coming back to the hard sciences for a second, I guess I would think that there may be a couple of things that they would tell us, and therefore might be interesting to have a look at. One is that there may be better standards of good work, more agreed upon at least standards of what's good work there. And so that might help us sort out a little bit some of these hypotheses from that perspective. And I think also it might help us sort them out from the perspective of self-selection, greed, etc. Because if it turns out that the hard sciences do have, less of a difference, or don't have a difference on in the political spectrum, I think they do. I think this has been said a little bit. But it does seem to me that if they have less of one or none, that would be suggestive also on the question of interest as well as, in that direction, in other words, as well.
In keeping with that question, is there any sign of politicization in the grant-making process? To the extent that there are government grants, is there any work that shows that those are politicized at all?
Not that I'm aware of. So, as an incoming freshman in college next year, I'm just curious I'm curious if there's any statistics on kind of student bodies in higher education, or if there's any political preference, like in admissions, if there's any selection in that. I know I was never asked what is your political preference, but I'm just wondering if there's any kind of statistics or data showing that admissions leans one way or another. Just kind of in academia, I don't know if there's any statistics on that, but or kind of student bodies as a whole in specific universities.
No, I don't think there's any evidence of that, or not that I'm aware of.
Well, graduate programs.
Graduate programs, there's a little bit, it's not. There's one important study on graduate programs which suggests that there's not much bias in graduate school admissions. That's one study. There's been, and it's sort of an outlier in some ways from a lot of the research that we've highlighted here today, and it's done by Neil Gross, who's a sociologist, and what he did is he sent. He actually did an experiment in which he sent fake emails to various graduate schools, and and they were identical, except one was a McCain volunteer, identified themselves as having worked on the McCain campaign, the other on the Obama campaign, and he looked at how quickly graduate school directors responded to those emails and coded the content of those emails, and found that there wasn't much difference. They responded a little bit slower to the McCain folks, but it wasn't statistically significant. And Gross thinks this is a sign that there isn't any bias in higher education. I think it's a misreading of this study. I mean, I guess I'm not so surprised by the finding. Professors are accustomed to replying to emails, right, to students from across the political spectrum. There's not really a decision of any consequence that's being made, right? They're not admitting this person into the program.
If they even read the resume, right?
Yeah, so I think I applaud him for doing the study, but I think it makes sense to me that it's kind of an outlier. It's the sort of one non-finding, right, in this larger body of work, and I guess I'm not so surprised.
At Northwestern, we used to, for a long time, had a Republican who was on the admissions committee. And since he retired and is no longer in the admissions committee, some of us have been noticing that the student body's been getting a little bit more left-wing. And so we're a little bit concerned that might be true, but we have no evidence. It's simply impressionistic. I think when you look at the kinds of people who are administrators, particularly in admissions, they tend to buy into a traditional social justice kind of model. So I'd be very surprised if there wasn't some discrimination, but I'm not aware of any studies that have shown that. I have often wanted to do a study in which I just took the results and reversed the signs of the predictors, and wrote up with one result, wrote it up with the other result, and see who would accept it and who wouldn't. But I don't know.
Professor David Friedman.
3 points. First, as an ex-physicist, I would point out that
everything, right?
I would point out that in the controversy over whether it was possible to make a hydrogen bomb, there was a very sizable political issue of a lot of physicists saying you couldn't, possibly because they wanted to believe that you couldn't. Second, if you want to look at the mechanics of the discrimination, a very interesting time to research would be the point at which climate change became a political issue. I haven't done this, but if you think about what was it like in departments that had climatologists before and after, because at this point it's very, very clear. I mean, if you look on the Facebook discussions, a group on climate, everybody assumes that if you're on one side of it, you're a conservative and probably religious and maybe creationist, and on the other side of it and so forth. But my third point, which is really a research suggestion, would be to see whether, if you look at who was being hired and at which time, which you're describing how to do, whether there is any correlation with which party most recently won the White House. If you think about it from the standpoint of an opportunistic department, which says, who do we want to hire in order that we can get grants in the future? It would make some sense to say, well, if it looks like the right is rising, maybe we should hire some right-wing faculty. If it looks like the left wing is rising.
You have it exactly backwards. I mean, I've had discussions with people where they've said, "Oh, I sure hope the Republicans," I mean, among people on the right, "I sure hope that Bush doesn't win because people are going to be so pissed they are not going to want to hire conservatives this year." So your assumption is that they're rational. And my assumption, and they would want to curry favor. My assumption is that that the thing's more salient when people are angry.
But we don't have to go on assumptions. We've got somebody here who has data.
Yeah, the only thing is, I wonder how much thinking about getting grants drives law school hiring. It seems like maybe the sciences would be more relevant. I'm not sure how many law professors actually seek any kind of NSF or any kind of funding along those lines. But it would be an interesting thing to see if there's any patterns with administrations and hiring. It seems like it's been pretty flat over the last 40 years, which would seem like maybe there's not a relationship, but I haven't looked at that data, so it could be.
So with that, we're out of time, and I'd like to thank our panel.